Twilight Princess is one of the most well-known Zelda games, and a major part of the experience is the dungeons. All of them are large, thematically distinct, and make excellent use of the new items located inside, making for one of the strongest sets of dungeons in the series. Without them, the game just wouldn't be the same, and I've really looked forward to discussing them in my dungeon ranking series. Without further ado, this is FP Productions, and here's my ranking of every Twilight Princess dungeon. Considering how late in the game it is, the Palace of Twilight is pretty simple. You go through a linear set of rooms on either side of the plaza, and then a third linear set of rooms until you get to the boss. There's no danger of getting lost, and there are no new items to collect, making the palace somewhat plain. Despite that, it's still a pretty good dungeon. The eerie music, otherworldly tech, and ethereal Twilight aesthetic create an unforgettable atmosphere, and carrying the souls to the outer plaza was a memorable challenge. Besides that, though, there's just not a lot going on, although the dungeon might rank higher if I were factoring in bosses. I really like the concept of the Goron Mines. Despite the fact that it's clearly set up as a dungeon, it actually passes as a genuine mining network pretty well, something Twilight Princess does a lot. The mines are filled with machines that stand out compared to most other places in Hyrule and feel relatively high-tech, which makes for a very interesting contrast with the game's medieval aesthetic. These machines make for puzzles involving switches, levers, and of course magnetic fields. Now that I think about it, most of these challenges are related to good timing or speed, but they're still different enough to stay interesting. As much as I like the setting in most of the puzzles, there's still not a lot happening on a general level. Navigation is simple for the most part, and there's no overarching thing you have to do throughout the dungeon. It also wouldn't have hurt to make Link a bit faster when walking on magnetic surfaces. As fun as it is to walk on the ceiling, that room takes way too long to get through. Overall, the Goron Mines provide a fun set of challenges in a unique setting, but don't have enough going on to go higher on the list. Hyrule Castle is a refreshing take on the usual final dungeon. Usually you'll either get a labyrinth filled with monsters, or a set of small gauntlets that reflect previous areas, but this time the game ends with a regular old dungeon. It's a strangely calm one too. There's no music in the outer courtyard, and in the lower floors it's a quiet rendition of the classic Hyrule Castle theme. This gives the castle a haunting sense of abandonment, which really fits with the game's story. As you progress, you really feel like you're infiltrating an enemy's base. Before you can even enter the interior, you have to break through the enemy's outer defenses and get the key. Then once you're inside, the music gradually gets more intense and the enemies more tough. Before you enter the final section, you're treated to a cutscene where Link's allies come to the rescue. Even though you never bump into them again, the story suggests that they're in there, joining you in taking back Hyrule. It was a very satisfying way to tie in some of the side characters and made the game's story that much better. All of this combines to give the dungeon a proper feeling of climax. One area that I particularly like is a completely optional room off one of the outer sections. It contains the implied resting place of the Hero's Shade, aka the Hero of Time, has a puzzle that took me a while to solve even though it ended up being simple, and has a mysterious vibe that gives me chills. This was a highlight of the dungeon for sure, but it's easy to miss. However, like the previous dungeons on this list, Hyrule Castle falls short in certain areas. Its puzzles are very simple, and even though they take a bit of observation and thought, they're not really the cleverest challenges the game has to offer. The setting, while appropriate, is not as exciting as some of the fantastical locations out there. Hyrule Castle is an improvement over the final dungeons of Ocarina of Time and Wind Waker, but still not the best compared to others in Twilight Princess. As the signature water dungeon, Lakebed is, in my opinion, just as good as the Water Temple and Great Bay Temple from the N64 games. Like those two, Lakebed revolves around a central puzzle related to water. In this case, you guide flowing water down a revolving staircase, which leads it to rooms where it activates mechanisms so you can proceed. Understanding which way you need to guide the water takes some thought and can genuinely get confusing, especially if you're playing the game as a little kid like I did my first time. I always love when a dungeon has this kind of overarching puzzle at work. In addition, the Lakebed Temple houses one of my all-time favorite items, the claw shot. Its use is, as always, very straightforward, but something about pulling yourself to distant targets is inherently fun. In this case, it contributes to the complex navigation of the dungeon by giving you more options for where to go. The Lakebed Temple is the type of dungeon that many players will hate, but I've developed a fondness for the complexity of water dungeons over the years. The fact that Lakebed Temple is this low on the list just goes to show how many great dungeons Twilight Princess has to compete with. Just going off general vibes, forest dungeons are probably my favorite type in the series, and Twilight Princess's Forest Temple nails it. It's carved inside a giant tree and has an earthy kind of aesthetic that I've always loved. While gameplay-wise it's not as creative or tricky as later dungeons, it's very impressive as the first one in the game. With the lengthy tutorial officially over at this point, the Forest Temple is free to throw things at you with far less handholding and obvious hints than you'd normally get in a first dungeon. The few items you have in your arsenal are all utilized well in small puzzles, and the place is pretty large. One aspect I've always enjoyed is rescuing the monkeys. Tracking them down is like getting on a little scavenger hunt, and it's always nice to have other characters helping you in a dungeon. I think it's implied that Ook, the mini-boss, was their leader who got corrupted by the Twilight bug or something, and even though he's never heard from again after helping you defeat the boss, it's still nice that they added a little subplot to the dungeon. Overall, it's an excellent one to start the adventure with. On a story and lore level, the Temple of Time is fascinating. To get there, you have to travel into the past through a ruined door in the Sacred Grove. Familiar music plays as you enter the iconic temple from Ocarina of Time, and after going to the area where the Master Sword was, you discover a previously unseen section. Having all that as a backdrop makes the Temple of Time dungeon memorable right off the bat, but the gameplay isn't shabby either. The first half of the dungeon is pretty simple. You progress forward using the items you've racked up throughout the adventure so far, solving a series of one-room puzzles. After you defeat the mini-boss and obtain the Dominion Rod, the true fun begins. You retrace your steps back through the temple, but this time with a giant statue in tow. Having to get this guy through each room completely changes the way you progress, and adds new dynamics to previously explored areas. Sometimes you simply smash your way through whatever lies in your path, and other times you have to think through some clever physics-based puzzles. Backtracking has never been more fun than this, and it was a unique way to structure the dungeon. Controlling a bunch of smaller statues is really fun too, and it's a shame that they didn't find too many more places to use the Dominion Rod outside this dungeon. In many ways, the Temple of Time is Twilight Princess's version of the Tower of the Gods from Wind Waker. Both have a similar whitewashed aesthetic and involve the use of ancient but technologically advanced statues. But Twilight Princess's version does much more with the concept. If not for the fact that it's relatively straightforward, the Temple of Time would easily have broken the top 3. The Arbiter's grounds give off a sense of foreboding from the moment you enter. The music is low and menacing, the lighting is dim, and skeletal monsters swarm you. This leads into an area where you have to go on a ghost hunt similar to Ocarina of Time's Forest Temple, and it's just as fun here. This is the first dungeon where you can freely switch into wolf form, and the ability is used to trace each ghost's route through the grounds and uncover buried objects. None of the other dungeons really utilize Wolf Link to this extent, and I'm glad he gets one chance to shine outside of the Twilight segments. Once you defeat the 4 ghosts, the Arbiter's grounds are only halfway over, but the next part is just as fun. Deep inside you fight Death Sword, one of the best mini-bosses in the game, and obtain the Spinner, one of the best items in the game. The spinner lets you climb up the sides of walls in certain places, and jumping back and forth from one wall to the next is exhilarating. Even without factoring in the epic boss battle, the Arbiter's grounds stand out thanks to their eerie atmosphere, use of wolf link, and fun item. If you've watched my previous 2 dungeon ranking videos, you probably know that I enjoy length and complexity, and City in the Sky delivers. With 8 floors, it's a total beast, and I love every second of it. The place is chock full of puzzles, and most of your main items are used at least once. Some of the rooms interconnect in clever ways, and you really have to think to figure out where you're going. As someone who looks for challenging dungeons, City in the Sky scratches that itch. The atmosphere is unforgettable. I mean, you're literally in the upper atmosphere, with clouds sprawled beneath you in every direction. The music is otherworldly and surreal, and the city consists of weird, vaguely futuristic structures. It's one of those settings that seems like it wouldn't work in a medieval fantasy game, but does. On top of that, the new item it contains is amazing. I can't say I expected to get a duplicate of an item I already had, and 11-year-old me was disappointed at first. But I soon realized how much of a game changer the additional claw shot was. Zipping from one target to the next like some kind of fantasy Spider-Man is one of the most fun things in the game, and gives you new ways to get around. All of that makes City in the Sky an excellent dungeon. One thing that always fascinates me is when these games take something that normally wouldn't be a puzzle-filled labyrinth and turn it into one, and Snowpeak Ruins goes above and beyond. Somehow, it captures the feeling of a real house and a Legend of Zelda dungeon without seeming contrived. It's such a unique sensation knowing that as you solve its puzzles and fight its monsters, you're not alone in some far-off temple, but just exploring somebody's home. Speaking of which, the ruins are home to 2 Yetis, fittingly named Yeto and Yetta. Through them, the dungeon does another thing I always love, having its own little story. Yetta has fallen ill, so before she can take you to the mirror shard that you came here for, you have to find ingredients to make soup for her, which is where your incentive to explore the dungeon comes in. Unfortunately, she's very forgetful, and sends you on a bit of a wild goose chase before you finally find the right ingredient. On the way, you stumble across the boss key and dungeon item, and I think this framing is hilarious. All this isn't even mentioning the specific gameplay. Snow dungeons are one of my favorite types in the series, and it's used to great effect here with sliding block puzzles and creatures made of ice. Many of the puzzles revolve around carrying ammo to cannons, which you fire to blast away obstacles. This is trickier than it sounds, since carrying a cannonball requires 2 hands and you can't use items without dropping it. It makes for some fun challenges. Finally, the Snowpeak Ruins are just mysterious. The sheer amount of theory videos about it on YouTube is testament to that. Who lived there? Why was it abandoned? What was its purpose, and why is it filled with cannons? Why are there paintings or perhaps photographs of other places around Hyrule? These questions just make the ruins all the more memorable, and they're a wonderful combination of gameplay, story, and intrigue. If you made it this far into the video, thanks for sticking around. I hope you enjoyed, and feel free to leave your own opinions in the comments. Next up is Skyward Sword, so subscribe if you want to hear my opinions on those dungeons. This is FP Productions, and I'll see you next time.